Okay. So yeah, usually I like to do really carefully rehearsed and organized presentations, and this isn't one of those. This is like unplugged. And you know, I guess part of the point here, and I guess one of the reasons that I'm really happy to be here, is that I was actually with Jeff something like 5 years ago when he first sort of talked about this thing that he wanted to do, and talked about, we actually kind of named it together, which is an okay name. But I have to say that at that time, I confess, it didn't exactly feel big. And I was a little bit ambivalent about it. And I knew what all these things that we're using, like Twitter and Facebook and now Tumblr and whatnot, are. I knew what they were, but I didn't really know what they meant and what they would come to mean. And I think that in a way, Jeff didn't really know that either, but he knew that they were important, and that's sort of part of his gift. And I've actually really come around on this, and I've come around not because of what Jeff says, but rather because of sort of who he is. So when Jeff asked me what I wanted to sort of talk about this morning, I said that actually I wanted to talk about Jeff. I wanted, yeah, and he thought that was an okay idea, and I wanted to do that not because he's my friend, and I love him, and not because he's the reason that we're all here, although that's also true, but because I have to say that, and in a real way, I didn't really understand what social media something really meant until I really kind of came to understand Jeff. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And everything that I'm going to tell you about is stories about Jeff, except for this first one, which is about a comic book. And I'm not really a comics guy, but there's a great writer named Warren Ellis, and he has a book that's not super well known, but it's beautiful, and it's called Global Frequency. Global Frequency is a comic book about the kind of antithesis of the superhero. It's a comic book in which there's 1,000 people around the world, and they're all kind of the best at whatever it is that they do. So they might be the best parkour runner or the best firewall hacker or whatever it is that they do. And when something goes down in the world, if there's a suitcase nuke in London or aliens land in Utah, which is where they always seem to land, somebody calls it in. And a call goes out on the global frequency. And those 1,000 people, these 1,000 people who are the best at what they do, all get a call. And they come in, and basically they sort of form these ad hoc human groups to save the world on a routine basis. And they're the opposite of, you know, some dude running around in underpants, right? It's this idea of 1,000 people who can somehow coordinate and make these impossible things happen. And that comic is a model for the world that's very different, not just from everyday life, but also just from what conventional comics even propose. And it sort of changed how I see the world. And in a way, it's very similar to the ways that Jeff changed it for me as well. We met 7 years ago, and what I knew about Jeff when we met was that he was this guy who'd done all this stuff in VoIP, and that he had started Vonage, and that he was like the badass who was responsible for the Pulver order, which is the reason that we can all use Skype, basically, broadly speaking, and that he threw really big parties, which is how he introduced himself to me. And so a couple years later, when we met up somewhere, and I asked him what was going on now, asked him what he's doing, he said the most surprising thing, which was ham radio. And you know, I knew the ham radio kids growing up. You can picture them, right? They had like the baseball hats and those big 40s mics, right, in their mother's basement. And the idea that Jeff was still doing this 30 years later was so amazing to me, and so sort of strange, and so like kind of anomalous in terms of anything that I understood. And we're having this conversation, in Kinneret, just on the Sea of Galilee, and it just doesn't make any sense. And then Jeff went on to tell kind of the craziest story, and I'm going to retell it here. This is 2010, and it was right after the earthquake in Haiti. And he told this story about how his friend Ann Curry was on the ground in Port-au-Prince, and that the Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, the plane was trying to come in, and the United States had taken over air traffic for Haiti and wasn't allowing it to land. And Ann Curry tweeted at U.S. Air Force, "Please let at MSF USA land their plane." And she did that, and Jeff retweeted it, and as he told it, a minute later, he got tweeted at U.S. Air Force that said, "At Jeff Pulver, we're on it." And an hour later, the plane landed with supplies and doctors and a lot of other amazing things. And this is kind of an amazing story. And it's the quintessential Jeff Pulver story. Because there's in that, there's a kind of hope and hubris and the effectiveness of those two positions in relationship to each other. But also in that story, and in listening to Jeff tell that, something kind of clicked for me in terms of thinking about what he was really about, which is that Jeff is sort of about this gradual ascent, these transitions from ham radio to VoIP to Twitter and everything like it, which is this kind of ascent, from tightly regulated means of communication between individuals to sort of broader and broader forms of connectivity, connecting strangers to strangers, not friend to friend, but rather strangers to strangers. And that essential impulse, that is the nerd sitting there with ham radio in his mother's basement, and that this idea of sort of eliminating the principle of distance in stranger-to-stranger communication is this sort of profound narrative that runs through Jeff's life that was sort of invisible to me up until that moment, and was invisible to me about what's actually happening in the world. And this thing of sort of being able to align the frequency of the United States Air Force with Jeff Pulver, with Ann Curry, with everybody who follows any of them, is kind of an amazing thing. And for the first time, you understand what's actually really happening. And to understand that, I first sort of had to understand Jeff. And I think back to Warren Ellis's book and Global Frequency about this sort of globally distributed superhero with 1,000 people who never even know each other. And I just think, it's actually happening, right? This is actually beginning to come together. And that there's this connection and calibration on a single frequency that's way bigger than the social graph or Justin Bieber or pop chips. And I think that this 1,000-person superhero is sort of that's the superhero that teen ham radio nerd kind of dreamed up, and is actually, like all of us, kind of bringing to life. And I think that's actually, in a weird way, what brings all of us here today, whether we knew that or not. Thanks.
Wow.